The bell struck before I sat down. Not a warning tone. Not the preliminary chime that usually rolled through the Hall of Measures before session. This was the iron bell itself, the one suspended above the central dais in a cradle of black alloy, and when the first custodian brought the hammer into it, the sound went through the chamber like a verdict looking for somewhere to land. Everyone else was already seated. I was still standing in the aisle with my slate tucked under one arm and the skin between my shoulder blades gone cold. My name is Talia Merin. I was 28 years old, born in Dock Ring 9 over Helio Station, educated on the long-haul records curriculum because my mother believed archives were safer than ships, and assigned that morning as junior protocol aide to Ambassador Soren Vale of the Terran External Mission. My job was simple. Stand half a step behind him. Carry the session notes. Speak only if spoken to directly. Look composed. I had trained for 6 years to look composed in rooms designed to remind humanity what it was not. I had not trained for this room. The Hall of Measures had been built by civilizations that liked stone because stone implied permanence and permanence implied moral authority. The ceiling arched high enough to make voices sound smaller on the way up. The walls were banded with 48 standard plates, each plate etched with the founding seal of a recognized sovereign power in the accord. Terran space had no plate. We had a temporary observer glyph on the lower wall beside the access corridor, recessed so far into the stone that from most angles it disappeared completely. Pending review. It had been pending for 12 years. The first custodian began reading. The translator bead in my ear warmed and pushed the old ceremonial language into standard speech. It did its best. On the third line, it rendered the formal classification assigned to humanity as persistent, non-compliant expansionary organism. On the fifth line, it simplified that to containment problem. On the seventh line, it gave up on a tonal phrase entirely and replaced it with designation carries funerary implications. I almost took the bead out. Then I looked at Ambassador Vale and left it in. He sat with his hands folded loosely over a paper folder. Paper. Actual paper. No one else in the chamber used it anymore. The Accord thought paper was theatrical in the wrong direction, too tactile, too personal, too close to eras when words had to remain where they were written instead of living obediently in approved cloud archives. Vale liked it for exactly those reasons. He was 59, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and looked like a man who had spent the first half of his life repairing things with tools not intended for precision and the second half explaining to elegant people why precision without durability was just expensive fragility. He always carried the same black fountain pen in his inside pocket. He had it now. Not writing, just holding it between two fingers like some men hold a coin. The reading continued. It was a long decree. Impressively long, in the way collapsing stars are impressive if you are at a safe observational distance. Unauthorized colonial expansion beyond sanctioned lanes. Interference in embargo quarantines. Provision of food, fuel, and engineering support to populations under corrective restriction. Settlement construction in 6 territories under active boundary suspension. Independent navigation beacons installed without Accord review. Failure to acknowledge corrective notices issued in the previous cycle. And then the one that changed the room, even though the custodian's voice never rose. Sustained continuation of civilization scale growth in disregard of projected extinction risk. I did not fully understand the sentence the first time the translator gave it to me. The second time I did. Around us, delegates shifted. There are many ways a chamber can go quiet. The first quiet is boredom. The second is attention. The third is the quiet of people suddenly aware that history may be becoming expensive. This was the third kind. The Vel host bench across from us dimmed to morning blue. The Surat delegation lowered their outer frills in what the protocol guide called ceremonial severance posture. One of the minor trade envoys actually bowed his head. They were attending a funeral. That was when I understood what the translator had meant by funerary implications. This was not censure. Not suspension. Not temporary exclusion. The Accord was not announcing a punishment. It was announcing a category. Humanity would be placed outside recognized interstellar legitimacy. No open routes. No shared registry. No arbitration standing. No treaty claim. No expectation that anyone already inside the system should continue behaving as if we belonged in it. The first custodian reached the closing passages. The old language changed shape there. Lower. Slower. The translator struggled, then settled into something flat and workable. By this decree, further standing is ended. By this decree, relation is concluded. By this decree, record is made complete. My grandfather used to say institutions loved the word complete because it let them pretend the future had signed the document too. The custodian's final phrase rolled down from the dais and died in the stone. Then nothing. No rustle. No cough. No movement except the faint automatic adjustments of recording lenses along the upper gallery. This, I knew from briefings, was the expected response window. Every civilization ever stripped of standing in the Hall of Measures had filled this silence somehow. Protest. Plea. Invocation of precedent. Ritual grief display. Formal request for reconsideration. Outrage if they were proud, sorrow if they were broken, and sometimes both if they were realistic. I looked at Ambassador Vale. He uncapped his pen. Not dramatically. Just the soft click of a man preparing to note a delivery number. He made one small mark on the top sheet of the paper folder, then looked up toward the dais with the calm attentiveness of someone listening to shipping terms rather than banishment. "Custodian," he said, and his voice carried farther than I expected, not because it was loud, but because he spoke into a silence everyone else was still treating like sacred ground. The translator rendered his words at once. "We'll need the archive seal on the written copy." No one moved. For one entire breath, the chamber failed to understand the sentence. Then understanding arrived all at once. A Surat envoy snapped both inner eyelids shut. One of the Vel turned from morning blue to a confused violet I had never seen in person. Two observer scribes in the upper gallery bent over their consoles so quickly one of them dropped a stylus. I felt something dangerous rising in my throat. Not panic. Laughter. Not because anything was funny. Because the emotional geometry of the room had just broken in a way that made panic look old-fashioned. The first custodian stared down at us. The translator, perhaps confused by tonal hesitation, added a subtle delay before giving us the response. "The decree is valid upon issuance." "I understand," Vale said. He put the cap back on the pen and slid it into the folder. "The seal is for our filing chain." He said it with complete professional courtesy, like a man clarifying warehouse procedure with a clerk who had missed a step. A murmur started somewhere to our left and died almost immediately when no one dared become the first visible loss of composure. The custodian turned, conferred in low tones with an adjutant, then faced us again. "The authenticated text," the translation bead said in my ear, "will be transmitted to your vessel within the standard period." Vale nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "That helps." Helps. As if we were discussing docking access. As if the largest political body in settled space had not just tried to narrate humanity into historical past tense. He rose. Not slowly enough to make a point. Not quickly enough to seem eager. Just rose because the matter, apparently, had entered the administrative stage. Every instinct I had as a protocol aide told me to stand half a step behind him. Instead I stood level. I do not know why I chose that in the moment. Maybe because the hall had just announced that we were outside the structure, and if that was true then its choreography no longer applied to me in the same way. Maybe because I was 28 and frightened and angry and had discovered, all at once, that fear changes flavor when the person beside you declines to kneel emotionally. Vale gathered the paper folder. The chamber watched us. 48 sovereign plates on the walls. Hundreds of diplomats. Recording galleries. The great iron bell still vibrating faintly in the air. And at the center of it, the expected ending had failed to happen. I fell into step beside him as he turned toward the exit. Behind us, the Hall of Measures remained silent in the stunned, unstable way of a machine that has accepted its own instruction and is only now realizing the instruction changed nothing essential. At the doors, I looked back once. The first custodian was still standing at the dais. Still holding the decree. Still, I thought, waiting for the part where humanity understood what had been done to it. But Ambassador Vale was already walking. And because he was, so was I. The hallway outside the Hall of Measures was lined with history. That was the first thing I noticed once the doors sealed behind us and the sound of the chamber dropped away. Not because the hallway was beautiful, though it was in the sterile, expensive way powerful institutions always preferred. The floors were pale stone veined in silver. The walls carried relief panels depicting every major consensus, treaty, correction, and admission in Accord history. Above each panel burned a soft strip of light calibrated to make the carvings look older than they were. History, curated into reassurance. I had walked that corridor 5 times in 4 days and felt nothing beyond the ordinary irritation of being watched in a place that pretended watching was a form of welcome. Now it was full. Delegation staff, observer teams, registry attendants, 2 rows of ceremonial guards, minor envoys who had no business being here and knew it, which was why they had arrived early. No one spoke. They had clearly heard the session result already, and the silence they gave us was not respectful silence. It was the silence people offer when they believe they are witnessing aftermath. Ambassador Vale kept walking at the same pace he had set inside the chamber. Not fast. Not dramatic. A sustainable pace, the kind that assumed you expected to reach wherever you were going. I matched it. 3 steps in, I realized I was no longer half a step behind him. 5 steps in, I wondered whether I should correct that. 7 steps in, I decided I would not. If the Accord had just informed us we were outside its order, then it no longer got to decide the geometry of my shoulders. I became aware, almost immediately, of the courier stationed halfway down the first stretch of corridor. Accord Archive Division. Gray sash, white gloves, sealed dispatch case in both hands. He had been waiting for the authenticated copy, or perhaps waiting to see whether the human delegation would collapse in a more administratively useful way before the copy became necessary. As we approached, he straightened. Ambassador Vale, he said, voice catching on the title as if the Chamber's decree had briefly made him uncertain whether it remained legal to use it. Vale slowed by perhaps 3%. The courier extended the case. Preliminary transmission receipt for the authenticated decree. Vale took it, weighed it once in his hand, then opened the lid and glanced inside. Missing secondary registry stamp, he said. The courier blinked. I looked at the document. He was right. Primary seal. Adjudication line. Witness chain. No secondary registry mark. It will follow in the full archive copy, the courier said, recovering some of his spine. The decree is valid regardless. I know, Vale said. So is a cargo manifest without the doc stamp. You still do not want to litigate that after the fact. He handed the case back. The courier stared at him for 1 full second, then at the document, then back again, as though he had encountered not defiance but a species of administrative literacy he had not been briefed to survive. I will correct it, he said. Appreciated. And then we were walking again. The corridor remained silent, but it had changed color somehow. Not literally. Socially. The crowd had expected us to carry the decree like a wound. Vale had handled it like a delayed invoice. That is a very difficult thing to do to an audience. At the first major junction, where the relief panels gave way to display alcoves holding relics from founding ceremonies, Vale stopped. I almost stopped too hard and had to correct my balance. He was looking at a kiosk inset into the wall beside a refreshments niche. Not even an attended stall. Just a service recess with trays of ration sleeves, mineral water capsules, stimulant packs, and the sort of compressed travel bars institutions stocked for people too important to admit they got hungry between pronouncements. Vale leaned closer to the display. What's the blue one? He asked. I followed his gaze. Compressed citrus protein, I think. Reliable. I have never met anyone enthusiastic about it. He considered that. Good enough. Before I could say anything, he tapped the payment plate with his wristband, took 2 blue-wrapped bars from the dispenser, and handed one to me. I accepted it automatically. He opened his own with the same attention he had given the decree. I looked at the bar in my hand. We were just expelled from recognized interstellar standing, I said quietly. Yes. And you're having a corridor snack. He took a bite, chewed once, and nodded as though confirming a structural estimate. You should eat when institutions overreach, he said. It clarifies proportions. I stared at him. Then, because there was nothing in the aide training handbook covering this exact scenario, I unwrapped mine and took a bite too. It tasted faintly of citrus and heavily of resignation. Ahead of us, one of the ceremonial guards shifted aside half a pace before we reached him. Then another. Not formally. Not enough to attract comment. Just enough to clear a line. I noticed it. So did Vale, I was certain. He never looked at the people moving, only at the path that existed after they had moved. That was another thing I was beginning to understand about him. He did not collect theater as proof. He let proof arrive in its own smaller, more durable forms. The second stretch of corridor sloped slightly downward toward the transit rotunda and the external docks beyond. 3 Accord security personnel joined us there under escort protocol, 2 to the rear and 1 to the front. The one in front was a junior route officer, surwrought by the articulation in his shoulders and the unfortunate brightness of his uniform trim. He set off at what was clearly meant to be a dignified escort pace. After 20 yards, we began overtaking him. Not on purpose. Vale never changed speed. The officer noticed, lengthened his stride, regained 6 feet of lead, then lost 4 of them over the next 30 seconds. He adjusted again. His dignity began to take on the visible mechanical quality of something maintained under stress. I would have felt sorry for him if the whole situation were not so educational. By the time we reached the rotunda, he had settled into a brisk near march that made his formal sash bounce against one leg at regular intervals. Vale continued at his same sustainable pace, citrus bar in one hand, archive receipt in the other, as though the station had always existed at a speed calibrated to him rather than the reverse. A cluster of neutral traders stood off to one side beneath the route displays. One of them, a narrow-faced Varen woman in transit gray, watched us pass and made the old cross-finger sign used in her culture for safe departure or successful smuggling. I could never remember which. A child in a family group near the outer glass looked up from a public star map and stared at us with open fascination, not fear. His mother touched his shoulder, but he did not look away. I found my hand tightening around the half-finished bar. The Hall of Measures had expected grief. The corridor had expected collapse. Instead we were walking through it eating compressed citrus protein while security tried not to lose step. At the final checkpoint before dock access, Vale paused just long enough to hand me the corrected receipt case when the courier, panting slightly, reappeared from a side passage with the missing secondary registry stamp added. Told you, Vale said mildly. The courier, to his credit, nodded like a man learning something expensive. When he moved away, I looked down at the decree sealed behind transparent film. The words were still there. Restriction. Termination. Revocation of standing. All the heavy, finished language stone chambers loved. And yet none of it felt final in my hands. Only documented. Vale glanced once at the sealed case, then at the long dock corridor opening ahead of us. Make a note, he said. I adjusted my slate under my arm. Of what? He smiled very slightly. That they made it official. Then he stepped forward, and the rest of us moved with him, and for the first time since the bell had struck in the chamber, I understood something simple enough that it felt almost embarrassing to have missed it. The decree was not the story. The walking was. We did not hold a crisis meeting. That is the detail most people would get wrong later, once the story had spread far enough to attract interpretation. They would imagine that the moment the outer dock sealed behind us, humanity's remaining formal delegation gathered around a tactical display and began drafting contingency doctrine under emergency lighting. What actually happened was this. Ambassador Vale asked whether the dockmaster had released our lane priority. Chief Navigator Imani cursed softly when she saw the answer. 2 engineers argued over a coolant imbalance in Shuttle Bay 2. I filed the authenticated decree into the mission archive under standing status, revoked because there was no existing tab for what had happened and the system required a tab before it would let me continue. Then someone asked whether the galley still had coffee. It did. The ship was the Wayfarer's Ledger, mid-range diplomatic class, old enough to have habits. I had lived aboard it for 9 months by then and knew the slight vibration under Deck 3 when the thermal pumps worked too hard, the leftward drag in Corridor C after hard docking, the exact pause between outer seal and clamp release that always made first-time passengers think something had gone wrong when in fact the ship was merely thinking about the next step. I stood in the records alcove with the decree open in front of me and listened to the familiar sounds of us not panicking. It was deeply confusing. A civilization had just been placed outside recognized legitimacy by the largest governing body in settled space, and the immediate emotional temperature on Deck 2 was mildly annoyed competence. I finally found Vale in the navigation room. Not at the head of it. Never at the head, unless he needed the symbolism for some external audience. He was standing slightly off-center with one hand braced on the back of a vacant station chair, looking at the route spread projected over the main table. Imani was beside him, dark hair tied up badly, still in station formals from the session except for her shoes, which she had apparently removed the moment she got back aboard and replaced with work boots. That alone made me trust her more. "Report filed," I said. Vale nodded without looking away from the chart. "Any archival pushback?" "Only from the records interface. It wanted a more standard classification." "What did you give it?" I looked down at my slate. Revoked standing, active continuity. That made Imani snort. Vale glanced at me then, not smiling exactly, but pleased in a way too efficient to waste on display. "Good." The chart over the table showed 6 near-system options inside our remaining fuel comfort range, 13 if we accepted hard margins, and 1 tight cluster of unaligned bodies outside normal diplomatic traffic. Most of them had poor atmosphere ratings, thin mineral interest, or both. In other words, the kind of places large institutions were happy to leave unnamed for long periods of time. Imani pointed at a pale crescent orbiting a gas giant on the outer edge of the cluster. "That one's breathable with support," she said. "Surface grav is tolerable, hydrology patchy but usable, and the basin scans suggest stable shelf rock under the southern flats." "Traffic?" Vale asked. "Almost none." "Claims?" "Not under Accord jurisdiction anymore if you take their decree seriously." That was when I realized what I had expected without admitting it. I had expected this conversation to be about where we could hide. It was not about hiding. It was about choosing where to continue. Vale studied the crescent for maybe 4 seconds. "It looks reasonable," he said. That was all. No speech. No symbolic naming. No grand declaration that we would begin anew beyond the reach of compromised systems. "It looks reasonable." Imani zoomed in, marked descent lanes, and started assigning power loads to approach. The meeting, such as it was, ended by dissolving into work. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, staring at the crescent on the display. "Is that it?" I heard myself ask. Vale looked at me. "That depends," he said, "on what you think it was." I opened my mouth and then closed it again, because the truthful answer was, I still thought it was the end of something. He must have seen that on my face. "The Accord announced a category," he said. "Categories are administrative. Gravity is physical. Air chemistry is physical. Shelter is physical. Try to prioritize accordingly." Then he turned back to the chart. We made planetfall 31 hours later. Moonfall, technically. The body did not have a formal Accord designation anyone aboard bothered using after the first 10 minutes. It was the 4th moon around a striped gas giant whose rings sat so low in the sky at dusk they looked like a thought someone had failed to finish. Our landing site was a broad stone basin cut shallow into the southern shelf, ringed by black ridges and open to a pale inland plain that sensor scans suggested would flood lightly during thermal shifts and then dry clean by the next cycle. Reasonable, in other words. The first boots down were engineering. Not Marines. Not diplomats. Not command. Engineering. That may tell you everything. By the time I came through the lower ramp with 2 archival cases and a field scanner, the initial shelter markers were already in. Orange stakes. Wind grid up. Power line chalked. One of the engineers, Ran Solano, was on his knees cursing happily at the soil density while another had already started arguing with him about where the first support footing should go. The air smelled faintly metallic and faintly green, like water thinking about becoming weather. Protocol. Imani called from halfway up a cargo pallet. I blinked at her. Yes. Pick a place for records that won't flood. It was such an absurdly normal instruction that I obeyed at once. I chose a slight rise near the central cargo stack and marked it with a blue beacon. Archive shelter. Temporary. I hesitated, then added on the field tag, until better exists. That phrasing stayed. By evening we had 3 frames up. By morning, 5. No one had formally assigned half the people doing the work. They simply emerged with gloves, tools, inventory straps, thermal blankets, scaffold pins, food crates, med packs, and the general expression of human beings who understand that if a roof is going to matter later, it matters now. I started a settlement log because that is what I knew how to do when the future lost category edges. Day 1. Landfall completed. Southern Basin selected for initial continuity site. Atmosphere acceptable with filtration support. Water extraction uncertain but promising. Formal authorization sought from no recognized body. None available. Status. Active. I read the entry back twice before saving it. Then I went outside again. That became the rhythm almost immediately. Log and move. Record and carry. Count and build. The work did not erase what the Hall of Measures had done, it merely refused to let that be the only active sentence in the day. On the 3rd morning, I found Vale standing on the western rise with a mug in one hand and the authenticated decree in the other. For one awful second I thought he had brought it out there for ceremony. Then I saw what he was actually doing. He was using the stiff paper backing to block the sun while he checked alignment on the first long shelter row. He noticed me looking. "It's finally useful," he said. I laughed before I could stop myself. That startled us both. He folded the decree once, tucked it under his arm, and pointed with the mug toward the basin floor below. The first frames had already become walls. A water reclamation unit sat half-assembled near the eastern edge. Someone had set a folding table beside the main cargo line and was sorting nutrient packs into categories with the grave intensity of a civilization founding itself around shelf stability and breakfast. "There," he said. "That's the only response they needed." I followed his gaze. People moving. That was all. People carrying load bars. People measuring spans. People arguing about door width. People from a mission that had just been formally removed from the Galactic Order deciding, with no visible hesitation, where to place the first permanent drain. The Hall of Measures had intended to give us an ending. Instead it had given us uninterrupted time. By day 4, the first external vessel appeared on long-range sensors and parked itself high above the basin for 6 hours without transmitting. By day 5, it was gone. By day 6, someone had left a sealed water marker 50 meters north of our primary shelter line. No official contact. No message. Just a flat disk of polished alloy encoded with a location pulse and the old route script used by outer lane pilots to mean, "This place is known." I logged it under external observation and stood there with the marker in my hand longer than necessary, feeling the desert air cool against my wrists. Reasonable, I thought. We had landed somewhere reasonable. And somehow that had begun to look visible. The first arrivals did not come dramatically. No fleet dropped from the sky. No distressed convoy limped over the ridge trailing smoke and symbolism. No one broadcast a plea for asylum into the basin air while we all stood in morally flattering positions waiting to become history. A freighter came in low on day 9 with one engine running hotter than the other and set down so carefully on the North Flats that I knew, before the dust even cleared, its pilot had spent a long time learning how to land damaged things without frightening the people inside them. That was the first sign. The second was that they did not ask whether they were allowed to be there. They asked whether we had potable water to trade. I was at the intake table when they walked in from the landing zone, 2 adults and 1 adolescent from a narrow-bone transit species I later identified as Hadron, though at the time all I registered was the lead woman's left sleeve patched in 3 different fabrics, and the way the younger one kept staring at our shelter frames with the expression of someone trying not to hope ahead of evidence. "Trade, then," I said, because that seemed to be the shape of the conversation. The woman nodded once. Trade first. Then questions. That earned my respect immediately. We traded 8 filters, 2 sealed med packs, and a crate of compressed grain in exchange for repair resin, a portable desal unit with 1 cracked handle, and a case of old navigation slates compatible with nothing we owned but adaptable to 3 things Ran insisted he could improvise from them. The Hadrons stayed for 6 hours. Then they stayed the night because their port engine had been lying to them about its integrity for longer than was polite. Then they stayed 3 days because the adhesive seal on the heat bleed assembly failed while George Ammon was demonstrating how not to force old bolts, and the lead Hadron woman, who introduced herself finally as Celi Nar, took one look at our central shelter line, the basin floor, the stacked cargo, the still unfinished water frame, and said, in a tone of deep professional inevitability, "You are short on hands." That was how the first non-human bunk got assigned. Not by proclamation. By labor shortage. I added them to the settlement log that evening. Day 9. 1 Hadron vessel landed under trade pretext, presently undergoing engine repair. Temporary residence. 3. Resin stock improved. Water position stable. No formal guest protocol yet established. Should probably correct that before it becomes embarrassing. By morning, it was already out of date. On day 11, 2 more vessels arrived within 3 hours of each other. One came openly, broadcasting merchant clearance codes that had technically expired under 3 different corridor agreements. The other came quiet and low, only lighting its descent beacons once it crossed our short-range perimeter. Imani looked at the sensor plot, looked at me, and said, "Either we've become a destination or a cautionary example. Which one is better?" "For traffic," she said. "Destination." The merchant turned out to be Darren compact traders carrying thermal cloth, dry legumes, and a folding fabrication table they swore they had no sentimental attachment to despite having named it. The quiet vessel carried 4 former contract researchers from a quarantine science lattice 2-jump spin ward, all of whom had heard, through channels none of them could explain cleanly, that the human settlement in the basin was operating without collapse. That was the phrase they used. Without collapse. As if this were a meaningful category of governance. I suppose, in retrospect, it was. They did not ask whether the Accord would object. They asked whether we had room for instruments, whether our dust load would interfere with air samplers, and whether anyone had a standing policy on children near volatile mineral reagents. "We do now," I said, and wrote one. That became my life more quickly than I had expected. Not diplomacy in the formal sense, but the creation of boring systems fast enough to stop new reality from tripping over itself. Temporary bunk assignments. Shared meal rotation. Landing priority. Medical disclosure thresholds. Trade logging. Quiet hours, which we introduced on day 13 and violated by day 14 but only in ways everyone agreed were morally defensible. We also acquired a chalkboard. I do not know who brought it. One day there was simply a long black board propped against the wall of the central shelter with 3 columns marked in white. Needs offers things people should stop pretending aren't their fault. The 3rd column was George's contribution, and I left it because it improved accuracy. Within an hour the board contained: need, copper line adapters. Offer, protein cultures, clean blankets, translation help. Stop pretending, water loss in South Line is not minor. Need, child height seating. Offer, navigation tutoring. Stop pretending, the generator hates optimism. It was the first truly public object in the basin. Not command. Not infrastructure. Not an engineering frame. A surface where the place could talk to itself. I began measuring settlement growth by what appeared on it. By day 15, we had names arriving before ships did. Someone in the outer lanes had started calling us the Basin Settlement. A Darren trader referred to us as the Calm Fault, which I did not understand until she explained that fault lines were where pressure stopped pretending it had nowhere to go. One of the researchers from the quarantined lattice called us post-jurisdictional, which was accurate but unusable in conversation. Among the human crew, we mostly said the basin and trusted that would be enough until a better word emerged or ceased to matter. The better word did emerge, just not from us. It came from a child. Not a human child. One of Celi Nar's people, the adolescent who had arrived with a damaged freighter and had spent the first 2 days pretending not to watch everything with total, aching attention. On the 16th morning I found them in the central shelter doorway staring at the chalkboard while Lucy Inner, former instructional officer, current everything that involved small hands coordinator, tried to sort cargo manifests at one end of a table. "What are you looking at?" I asked. The adolescent pointed at the board. "In our route tongue," they said carefully, "a place that keeps being where you left it is called a holdfast." I repeated it once under my breath. Holdfast. Lucy looked up from her manifests. "That's better than basin." "Basin is descriptive," I said. "Holdfast is also descriptive," she said. By evening the word had spread without any meeting authorizing it. That is how you know a settlement has accepted a thing. No one debates it enough to remember who first said it. I updated the log. Day 16. Population now 37 humans, 19 non-human residents across 6 species. Shared name in growing informal use. Holdfast. Unclear whether this is temporary. Increasingly seems rude to call anything temporary unless the walls agree. On day 18, the water marker to the north became a visitor. A Cathy ground shuttle touched down at sunrise and one solitary figure stepped out carrying a pack, a folded tool harness, and the posture of someone doing something difficult in a culture that prized difficulty only when properly licensed. He stopped 3 meters from the intake line and said, in slow but competent standard, "I have left service." I waited. He waited too, perhaps expecting a challenge. "What do you want?" I asked. "To build," he said. There are moments when all the great theoretical structures of diplomacy, authority, exile, and cross-species law condense into something much smaller and stranger. This was one of them. "Do you have a place to sleep?" I said. He looked very briefly surprised. "Yes." "Good," I said. "Then fill out the arrival sheet and do not insult George by touching anything mechanical until he has assessed your competence." The Cathy inclined his head in what I later learned was gratitude disguised as discipline. His arrival did more to alter the emotional weather of the basin than the previous 8 combined. Not because he was important in a formal sense. Because his presence made something undeniable. This place was no longer only somewhere the rejected came to survive. It was somewhere people crossed lines to join. That evening the central shelter was too loud for thought. Children under tables. 3 languages near the cook line, 6 if you counted the side arguments. Lucy trying to explain number grouping to 2 Hadron siblings and 1 exhausted human engineer using bolts as counting stones because we still had not built proper learning slates. George at the far wall reviewing load diagrams with a newly arrived Cathy while pretending the discussion was purely structural and not a tentative form of trust. Selly NAR patching thermal cloth beside a Darren trader who had appointed herself in charge of everyone's sleeves whether they wanted her to or not. I stood in the doorway with my slate and realized, with a kind of private disorientation, that I was no longer recording emergency adaptation. I was recording civic accumulation. This was the dangerous part. Not militarily. Administratively. Once a place accumulates habits, roles, recurring jokes, children's seating needs, competing soup preferences, and an argument over whether the south wall should hold a shared route map or a memorial board, it becomes much harder for any external decree to narrate it as provisional. You can banish a delegation. You can embargo a fleet. You can suspend a registry. But a place where 6 species are already annoyed at one another about shelf organization begins to resist abstraction. Late that night, after quiet hours had once again failed in ways no one regretted, I sat at the records table and looked over the incoming traffic list for the next cycle. 3 arrivals confirmed. 2 possible. 1 inquiry from a neutral station asking whether Holdfast had established trade law. 1 message from an unregistered relay simply reading, "Heard you were still there. Is that true?" I opened the daily log. Day 19. Holdfast now operating beyond initial continuity assumptions. Population 64 across 9 species. Meal rotation formalized. Shared board accepted as governing instrument despite no one admitting this directly. Question increasingly less whether we are permitted to remain. Question increasingly more how many people are on their way before the old order understands what this place has become. I stopped writing then, because I heard something outside the records shelter that made me put the slate down and listen. Laughter. Not relief laughter. Not nervousness. Just ordinary overlapping laughter from people who expected to see one another in the morning. I sat with that for a moment. Then I added one final line. Other people have started treating it like a place. And that, I understood, was when the basin stopped belonging only to us. The Accord did not send warships. That is worth recording correctly. Later, once Holdfast had become the kind of place people argued about in lecture halls and policy chambers far away from any dust, there would be a tendency among dramatic people to improve the story in the wrong direction. They would imagine steel in orbit, weapons lock warnings, banners, threats delivered in amplified voices over an open sky. What the Accord actually sent was worse, in the way paper cuts are worse when they happen at the right joint. They sent compliance. The vessel came in on day 23 just after midday, narrow-hulled and matte gray, with the Accord's audit seal on its flank and the sort of landing posture that implied a crew trained to believe the ground would eventually cooperate if addressed in the proper tone. It touched down on the north flats beyond the water rigs, perfectly centered inside the marker array Imani had laid out for freight approach and which no one had, until that moment, bothered to label non-welcoming by default. I was at the records table when the descent alarm chimed. Not the hard alarm. Not defense. Just incoming formal traffic, which on any other day would have meant a trade vessel, a delayed courier, or Sally NR forgetting to announce herself until the landing thrusters were already in view. George looked up from a dismantled pump valve. "That's official paint," he said. I closed the log. "Yes." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Do we dislike official paint today?" "Probably." By the time I reached the landing zone, half the basin had already become busy in the specific way people become busy when they are trying not to look like they have stopped to watch something. Lucy was guiding the children toward the learning shelter with the too bright patience of a woman who knew exactly when institutions should not be allowed near open curiosity. George had somehow, without any visible motion, repositioned himself between the tool racks and the descending shuttle. The Cathy builder, who had given us a use name, Vin, after deciding his full-service designation was unsuitable for casual conversation, stood beside the half-finished wall line with the motionless alertness of someone for whom inspection had once meant danger in a more personal register. Ambassador Vale arrived last. Not because he was unprepared. Because he preferred to let official people see the place before they saw the man they expected to control it. The shuttle opened on hydraulic silence. The being who stepped down from it was tall, jointed in ways that made stillness look engineered, and carried a documentation cradle large enough to suggest either great thoroughness or profound insecurity. Its species was Aelith, one of the Accord's old procedural civilizations, famous for law, memory, and the sort of institutional patience that occasionally mistook itself for moral superiority. Its outer mantle was a restrained charcoal. Its insignia cords were white. Field Adjudicator Sen Var. I knew the name before the translator bead supplied it because the Accord had circulated the appointment through 3 public channels with all the subtlety of a threat disguised as process. Var reached the edge of the landing struts and stopped. The basin wind moved dust lightly around its boots. Its gaze went first to the shelter rows. Then the water rigs. Then the chalkboard near the central path. Then the children disappearing into Lucy's shelter with colored stones in their pockets and one Darren child still chewing on a strip of dried root. That sequence mattered. I could tell it mattered because Var's documentation cradle did not rise for the first 4 seconds. Then Vale stepped forward. "Adjudicator," he said pleasantly. "Ambassador Vale." The title was deliberate. So was the lack of warmth. Var opened the cradle, and light unfolded between its hands into a layered procedural display. "I am here," it said, "under authority of the Accord Oversight Registry and the Inter-Sovereign Compliance Charter to assess the legality, standing, and status of all structures, contracts, affiliations, and continuity claims presently operating at this site." Vale nodded once. "Of course." That seemed to unsettle Var slightly. People expecting resistance are always faintly damaged by cooperation. "You have been informed," Var continued, that the revocation decree issued by the Hall of Measures remains under active external review. Yes. You have proceeded with settlement activity regardless. Yes. You have accepted non-human residents regardless. Yes. Va paused after the third yes, perhaps waiting for complexity to arrive and rescue the conversation from its own directness. It did not. Finally it said, I will require access to your founding authority. Vale turned his head a fraction toward me. Talia. I passed him the grey folder from under my arm. He handed it to Var. Our founding charter was 8 pages long, 6 signatures on the original line, another 43 attached in supplemental residency endorsement, and 3 appendices added after the second trade vessel because the Hadron objected, correctly, to the way our first draft handled shared water obligations during maintenance hours. Va scanned the first page. Then the second. Then all 4 of its hands went still. This charter is dated day 3, it said. Yes, Vale said. The decree was issued day 1. Yes. And your legal basis for filing is cited in Appendix 2, I said. Var looked at me then, perhaps only just registering that aides in this basin spoke without waiting to be arranged into silence. It flipped to Appendix 2. There it was, a stitched legal foundation drawn from dormant human colonial law, neutral space non-prohibition language, and the delightful technicality that once humanity had been expelled from Accord standing, the Accord's member restrictions on expansion no longer attach to us in the same way unless independently recognized by a non-Accord authority. Which, inconveniently for everyone who preferred permanence to flow one direction only, they were not. Var read for a long time. Around us, the basin kept moving. Not performatively. Actually moving. A water cart rolled past behind George. Someone from the cook line shouted that if the thermal trays were left out one more time they would be reassigned to people who understood gratitude. One of the children inside Lucy's shelter laughed so hard at something that the sound carried clear across the dust. Va closed the charter. This was prepared in advance. Vale tilted his head slightly. We work with the time available. That was the first strike. The second came 15 minutes later. Va requested a list of all non-human residents presently operating within the site. I gave it to him. Then the residency contracts. Then the trade declarations. Then the work agreements. Then the neutral registry acknowledgements filed through the nearest unaligned traffic station because, after day 11, I had realized with a kind of cold joy that undocumented hospitality was just sentiment waiting to be misquoted. Va read every page. This individual, it said, pointing to Vin's name, is former Accord security personnel. Former, I said. He has attached 3 letters of recommendation. Yes. He included a proposed framework for admission review. Vin, who had appeared at some point beside George without my noticing, said with perfect seriousness, it seemed inefficient not to. A sound moved through the basin then, not laughter exactly, because no one wanted to be rude first, but the shared pressure of people discovering at once that the old procedural languages of power had somehow been dragged into our weather and made to answer to us instead. VAR did not react. To its credit, it remained composed in the way good officials remain composed when realizing their instruments are being used in an environment for which they were never calibrated. Then it asked to inspect the central educational shelter. That was the dangerous part. Not because anything inside it was illegal. Because legality was a small frame for what that room had become. Lucy met us at the door with chalk on one wrist and the expression of a woman who had already accepted 3 impossible things before breakfast and therefore saw no reason a 4th should improve her mood. Inside, 14 children from 7 species sat in a loose semicircle around a low work table. Colored stones were sorted by value groupings and shape logic on one side, sound markers on the other. A Hadron child was showing a human boy how their route glyphs handled subtraction. One of the Darren children had drawn a diagram on the floor slate so ambitious it had ceased being mathematics and become architecture. VAR stopped in the doorway. The room was warm. Bright. There were labels on every shelf in multiple scripts. Child-height seating along one wall. A basin-made latch at the door that could be opened by 5 distinct hand configurations because the original handle had caused an argument and the argument had improved the building. Who authorized this structure? Var asked quietly. Lucy looked up from the table. The children did, she said. By needing somewhere to be at the same time. Var said nothing. One of the children looked at it with frank curiosity. Another pushed a cup of stones slightly aside to make room at the table, the way children do when they have not yet learned that institutions require different forms of hospitality from people. Var did not enter. It stood there long enough that even the translator bead seemed to hesitate, as if uncertain whether silence now qualified as an official language. When it finally turned away, it made no immediate notation. That frightened me more than if it had made 20. The inspection continued for another hour, but the shape of it had changed. It no longer felt like enforcement. It felt like an intelligent machine walking through a place where its categories had begun to come apart in the light. Before returning to the shuttle, Var asked for one final thing. Your current status statement, it said to Vale. In one sentence. Vale thought for perhaps half a second. We are living here, he said, at a level of organization your decree failed to anticipate. Var held his gaze. Then, without reply, it boarded the shuttle and left. We watched the vessel rise, angle north, and disappear into the pale upper sky. No one cheered. George spat into the dust and went back to the pump valve. Lucy returned to the children. Vin stood beside me for a moment, watching the empty sky. What happens now? He asked. I looked down at the inspection notes still open on my slate, then at the gray dust settling slowly back over the landing zone, then beyond that to the shelters, the rigs, the chalkboard, the people who had already resumed the ordinary work of staying. Now, I said, they discover the problem is not whether we complied. Vin turned his head slightly. What is the problem? I saved the notes. They do not have a category for a place that kept building after rejection, I said. That evening, I opened the daily log and wrote, Day 23. Accord compliance inspection completed. Findings pending. Children unimpressed. This may be our strongest legal position so far. The Accord did not send the report to us directly. That was expected. Power hates admitting it is speaking to people it has already declared beneath formal address. So the document arrived the way institutional embarrassment often arrives. Routed through public channels, copied to neutral registries, and made visible to everyone who is not supposed to count as the primary audience. I found it in the morning transmission bundle between a freight delay advisory and an updated commodity index from the Surat lanes. For a full second I thought I had opened the wrong file. Then I saw Field Adjudicator Senvar's seal at the top and understood that no, this was in fact the correct document and the Accord had simply failed to invent a more graceful way of saying what it now needed to say. I read it standing up. By the second paragraph I was sitting down. The report was 21 pages, which was shorter than I expected and therefore somehow more dangerous. Long reports often indicate officials still believe volume can perform authority. Short reports mean someone has stopped wasting words on systems already breaking. Var had done what good officials do when reality humiliates them. It had described the humiliation precisely. Founding charter. Valid under non-accord jurisdictional interpretation. Resident contracts. Lawful within current external standing conditions. Trade agreements. Enforceable through neutral party registries. Educational structure. Operational, multi-species, non-military, functionally permanent. Settlement continuity. Active. Non-human affiliations. Voluntary, documented, and not subject to existing Accord compulsion provisions where operating outside recognized internal jurisdiction. I read each line twice. Then I reached the final section. Assessment. Site remains non-compliant with the intended political effect of Hall Decree 14. Site is not non-compliant in a manner enforceable by existing external charter instruments. No threat assessment applicable under present models. Population does not appear to recognize a governing authority capable of compelling discontinuation. Current Accord framework is insufficient to classify or reverse continuity once established under these conditions. I sat very still with the transmission open in front of me. The room around me remained ordinary. Records hum. Vent line rattle. Distant foot traffic. Someone outside dragging a crate over stone with more optimism than technique. The basin had no idea, yet, that the Accord had just produced the closest thing institutions ever make to an admission of conceptual defeat. Not militarily. Worse. Administratively. The old system had finally named the real problem, and the problem was not that we had broken it. The problem was that we had kept going somewhere it no longer knew how to reach us. I forwarded the report to Vale. He replied 3 minutes later. Morning brief in 10. Bring page 19. Page 19 was the assessment section. Of course it was. By the time I reached the central shelter, the basin was already moving through its usual first-hour patterns. Water teams rotating. Supply board half updated. Lucy walking toward the learning shelter with a stack of slates under one arm and a Hadron child trotting beside her, arguing passionately about whether symbols should be sorted by sound or shape. George and Vin at the east wall with the secondary processor panel open again because nothing in any functioning settlement remains fixed merely because yesterday's repair was emotionally satisfying. No one looked like history had happened. That was becoming one of my favorite qualities in us. The morning brief took place around the same long table where, 3 weeks earlier, we had first sorted nutrient packs by category and pretended that was not also constitutional work. Vale sat at one end with coffee. Imani to his right, already halfway into the day's shipping routes. Selly NAR with engine grease on her sleeve. George standing instead of sitting because he distrusted chairs in any meeting likely to produce labor. Vin with a paper packet open, taking notes with startling devotion. Lucy late by 2 minutes because one of the children had found a way to convert arithmetic into a corridor game and she had been forced to adjudicate. I passed page 19 to Vale. He read it once. Then again. Then he slid it into the center of the table. Imani leaned in first. Her eyes moved down the page and sharpened. Oh, she said. Selly NR took it next. That sounds expensive. It will be, Vale said. George did not bother asking for the page. Do they know they lost? They know, I said. They may still call it review. Lucy arrived as he said that, accepted the page from Selly, and read the assessment standing up. When she got to the line about the population not recognizing an authority capable of compelling discontinuation, she looked up. That's quite good, she said. It is not intended as praise, Vale said. No, Lucy agreed, which is why it's better. Vin asked for the page last. He read slowly, jaw set in the severe concentration of a man for whom official documents were still half sacred, even when they were declaring sacred instruments inadequate. Finally he looked up. In my prior service, he said carefully, a report like this would trigger framework revision. Imani drank her coffee. Will it here? Yes. Vale nodded. Of course it will. That sat over the table for a moment. The basin outside continued its mourning. Somewhere beyond the shelter wall I heard laughter, then the immediate tonal shift of someone dropping something metal and pretending it had been deliberate. Selly NAR folded her arms. How bad? I answered before I could stop myself. Possibly very. Vale glanced at me. Explain. So I did. The report does not say we are manageable, I said. It says the current accord cannot classify us in a way that creates reversal leverage. That means the next move, if they choose one, will be to build a larger category. New language. New cross-charter provisions. External pressure on neutral registries. Route discouragement. Third-party liability. Some form of administrative wall building. George made a dissatisfied sound. Can they? They can try, Vale said. Vin looked at the page again. Will it work? Vale set down his coffee. There are people who answer questions. Then there are people who decide, very quietly, which emotional architecture the room is about to stand inside. He did the second thing. Not if we behave like the report is correct, he said. No one spoke. He continued. The Accord's problem is continuity. Not our arguments. Not our indignation. Not our symbolism. Continuity. That means our answer remains the same as it has been since day one. Water, food, trade, housing, repairs, learning, records, routes, and the next structure built before the previous structure starts feeling inevitable. Lucy smiled at that. George looked less dissatisfied. Nar cracked one knuckle thoughtfully. Imani's attention had already drifted toward what looked, from experience, like 3 separate route problems she intended to solve before lunch. Only Vin still seemed caught by the page itself. The report says, he said slowly, that the population does not recognize authority capable of compelling discontinuation. Vale looked at him. Yes. Vin lowered the page. Is that true? I think that was the moment the room became philosophical, whether it wanted to or not. The easy answer would have been yes. The cleaner answer too. It would have sounded defiant and probably quoted well later. Vale, naturally, did not give it. It is true, he said, that authority which cannot reach lived reality is eventually treated as weather. Not ignored. Accounted for. But not obeyed in any deeper moral sense. Vin absorbed that with visible care. Nar muttered, "That's almost worse." "It's more durable," Lucy said. George, who had had enough of ideas not yet translated into load-bearing terms, tapped the table once with 2 fingers. "So what changes today?" Vale looked around the room. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "That would be indulgent. Talia, update all external logs to reflect active continuity recognized by neutral review. Imani, move on the 2 route offers from last night before the Accord decides delay counts as strategy. Lucy, expand the learning shelter. It stopped being temporary a week ago and the walls know it. George, finish the processor and then assess whether we can support a second fabrication line before the next wave arrives." He looked at Vin. "And you," he said, "finish your admission framework." Vin blinked. "We are using it?" "We are no longer small enough to pretend process is optional." Something changed in Vin's face then. Not relief. Something straighter. I understood it. For some people, recognition feels like freedom. For others, it feels like finally being given work proportionate to belief. The meeting dissolved. That is another thing worth recording correctly. The old order had just been told, in its own language, that its framework was too small to stop us, and our immediate response was not celebration. It was tasking. I went back to records and updated the public board. Status: Holdfast continuity externally acknowledged through neutral review. Trade routes remain open. Residency filings valid. Learning shelter expansion underway. Please stop leaving and sign tools near the eastern wall. By noon, 3 copies of the report assessment had already circulated hand to hand through the basin. Not because anyone was worshipping it. Because people like seeing the moment a powerful system is forced to describe them more honestly than it intended. The reactions varied. George read the page, grunted once, and used it to level a crate before giving it back to me. Lucy read it and pinned a copy near the children's slate wall, not for politics, she said, but because some of the older ones were starting to ask useful questions about why adults from 14 species now lived here on purpose. Nar read it, laughed once without humor, and said, "I have been trying to tell institutions that for 20 years. Vin requested an official copy for his records bundle. Of course he did. The most important reaction, however, came from outside. That evening, just before dusk, the General Traffic Board updated with 3 new incoming confirmations and 1 message routed from a neutral station 2 systems over. It was short. "Read the report. Do you have room for 6 more?" I stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed and had to be touched awake again. Then I went outside. The basin at dusk had begun to acquire a look I had not known to expect from a place founded under banishment. Light held low along the shelter edges. Shadows stretching long across the stone. The sound of dinner work from 3 directions. Children still talking over one another inside Lucy's not temporary anymore structure. Vin on the north path measuring ground anchors with the solemn concentration of a convert. Vale standing near the western rise with his coffee, as if he had always intended to spend this chapter of his life out here, proving a report correct by continuing to exist in public. I walked over and stood beside him. He did not ask why. After a moment I handed him my slate and showed him the incoming message. He read it. 6, he said. Yes. He handed the slate back. Do we? He asked. That could have meant housing. Water. Space. Nerve. All of it. I looked out over Holdfast, the walls, the lights, the board, the children, the half-finished second row of shelters, the repaired processor humming steadily, the place the Accord had failed to classify out of being. Yes, I said. He nodded once. Then answer yes. I did. That night, in the daily log, I wrote, Day 24. External review confirms the Accord framework is too small. This has increased traffic. Apparently conceptual failure reads as hospitality from a distance. Need 6 more bunks. The Accord rescinded the decree in the middle of breakfast traffic. Not with a summons. Not with an envoy. Not with the sort of ceremonial reversal the Hall of Measures would have preferred if ceremonies still belonged to it in the same way. The update came through the general transmission bundle on day 37, nested between a corridor fuel index and a neutral weather advisory from the Surat lanes, exactly where institutions hide their embarrassment when they need it recorded but not admired. I opened it because I open everything. At first I thought the translator bead had misrendered a phrase. Then I read it again. Hall Decree 14, concerning the revocation of Terran standing and associated continuity restrictions, is hereby suspended pending full Accord review. All external trade and registry barriers enacted under provisional enforcement guidance are lifted effective immediately. Re-registration pathways are restored under temporary neutral supervision. I sat there with a spoon halfway to my mouth and the transmission hovering above the breakfast table like a badly told joke. The porridge in my bowl cooled. Outside the record shelter, I could hear morning noises beginning in their ordinary layers. One cargo cart wheel that still needed realignment, children's voices near Lucy's structure, George already saying something disapproving to a piece of equipment that would probably work anyway out of shame. I read the notice a third time. Then I checked the route board. The route board had changed. Our previously blocked corridor access had reopened in 3 directions. Neutral registry holds were gone. 2 of the trade permissions Imani had been preparing to route around by force of patience were now marked clean. I forwarded the notice to Vale. His reply came back in under 4 minutes. Are the trade lanes actually open, or are they emotionally open? I checked again. Actually open. His second reply took less time. Good. Morning brief in 10. Bring the full record. Of course he wanted the full record. At the morning brief, no one looked surprised for longer than was practical. That was one of my favorite things about Holdfast by then. We had acquired a culture of absorbing major political reversals at roughly the same emotional intensity other settlements reserved for weather shifts or failed pump seals. Not because the reversals did not matter. Because if you allow institutions to choose the dramatic scale on which your life becomes significant, you end up living at the wrong altitude. Vale took the printed copy from me, not the summary, the full procedural record, and scanned the first page while Imani poured coffee into a mug that had once belonged to some forgotten station authority and now bore 3 separate repair lines across the handle. Routes? He asked. Open, I said. Registry. Temporary neutral supervision, but yes. Good. That was the whole of his reaction. Celie Nar, seated beside him with a tray of parts she had no business bringing to a briefing but always did anyway, looked up from the notice. That is all, she said. Vale turned 1 page. They were going to retreat eventually, he said. The only remaining question was whether they would do it elegantly. George, standing with one shoulder against the support strut because he still distrusted chairs in planning contexts, made a small sound through his nose. They did not. No, Vale said. But they did do it in writing. That, more than anything, seemed to satisfy him. Lucy arrived late by 90 seconds with chalk dust on one sleeve and a Hadron Child's question still on her face. She took the notice from me, read it standing up, and then glanced toward the open shelter door where morning light was cutting across the floor. So, she said, nothing changes. Imani snorted. Everything changes, she said. Which is why, in practical terms, nothing changes. Lucy considered that and nodded once. Right. Vin asked for the record last. By then his application framework had reached 192 pages and developed appendices sophisticated enough that even George had stopped pretending it was unnecessary. He read the notice carefully, then read the procedural reversal note attached to it, then the vote breakdown. The suspension was not unanimous, he said. No, I said. Read the dissents. He did. Then he handed the page back to me very slowly. I had already read them 3 times in the record shelter, but I read them again because certain sentences improved through irritation. For sovereigns had voted to maintain the decree. Their formal rationale, entered permanently into the Accord record, read, Terran continuity under independent standing conditions presents a destabilizing precedent not to border integrity but to civilizational expectation. Their demonstrated capacity to proceed without procedural legitimacy may alter other species' assumptions regarding what authority is required for durable expansion. I kept turning that over in my mind, the way one turns a found object to see where exactly it stops being insult and becomes unwilling truth. Sally read it over my shoulder and laughed once without amusement. That is the cleanest admission of panic I've ever seen from a government. Lucy, who had settled finally into a chair with her own coffee, took the page next. They are not afraid of us being violent, she said. No, Vale replied. They are afraid, she continued, that other people watched us keep going. Vale looked at her over the rim of his mug. Yes. That was the real reversal, and the Accord knew it. Not that the decree had failed to remove us. That would have been administratively humiliating and survivable. The deeper problem was that the decree had demonstrated something public and portable. Legitimacy might not be a gate you pass through. It might be something life generates after a certain threshold of continuity: work, children, walls, trade, and shared morning noise. That is a dangerous idea if your entire civilization is organized around being the body that names what counts before it counts. The morning brief, however, did not become philosophical for long. Imani moved immediately to freight routing. Selly wanted to know whether reopened lanes meant we could finally stop overpaying for copper adapters. George had opinions about whether any of this justified delaying the secondary fabrication line. Lucy asked whether restored registry access meant the learning shelter could be recognized as a formal educational site or whether that would simply invite the wrong kind of interest. Vin, astonishingly, wanted to know whether the re-registration pathways altered the legal status of his admission framework. Vale answered each question as if we were discussing ordinary weather. Copper first, he said to Selly. Never let reconciliation occur before supply stabilization. To the school question, he said to Lucy, not yet. Recognition is often just a slower form of claim. To Vin, he said after a pause long enough to suggest he was enjoying himself slightly, your framework remains applicable because people will keep arriving whether the Accord approves of the pathway or not. Vin nodded with the solemn focus of a man receiving sacred text. Then the meeting dissolved into assignments. That was the part one loved most. The largest political body in settled space had just blinked, and our immediate collective response was not celebration. It was work allocation. Outside, the basin had already started adjusting to the news in its own stubborn way. Trade confirmations began coming in before noon. 3 vessels rerouted their approaches toward us as if the Accord's reversal had merely removed an obstacle in the paperwork they had already decided to ignore emotionally. By early afternoon, the chalkboard near the central path had a new line under offers. Fresh fruit, corridor grade, now that official people have recovered their nerve. Under things people should stop pretending aren't their fault, someone, almost certainly George, had added. The Accord. I left it there for 2 full hours before moving it to the corner labeled editorial. The most visible change came from the children. There were 26 of them by then, from 14 species, and children react to legitimacy the way birds react to treaties. Not at all, unless the consequences alter where the food is or who gets yelled at for climbing something unsafe. Lucy told them, in language adjusted for 6 developmental frameworks and 3 translation habits, that some old rules had been changed elsewhere and that this meant more books might arrive on the next trade vessel. That was what mattered to them. More books. Not the rescission. Not restored standing. Not the great bureaucratic correction of a decree the Hall of Measures had delivered like cosmic finality 36 days earlier. More books. I stood in the doorway of the expanded learning shelter while Lucy explained this, and watched one Darren child immediately ask whether the new books could include better star maps, and a human boy argue that story collections were strategically more important than maps, and a Hadron girl insist they were all missing the point because what they actually needed were language cards that didn't assume anyone had the same number of fingers. Lucy rubbed one temple and said, "Good. We are becoming a civilization." I laughed out loud. Later that afternoon I finally read the full chamber transcript of the rescission debate. Not all of it. Enough. Enough to understand that the Accord had not rediscovered sympathy. It had rediscovered consequence. Member powers wanted access restored. Neutral stations had started treating Holdfast contracts as more reliable than some internal Accord arbitration chains. 2 quarantine species had publicly asked why their restrictions remained morally coherent if the Terrans could be cast out and continue building multi-species continuity without collapse. A Surat economic bloc had, in language so polished it almost concealed the threat, asked whether member trade should be expected to endure indefinite political self-harm. In short, the old order had not changed its values. It had been forced to acknowledge their cost. By evening the basin wind had turned cool. I took the day's final transmission bundle to the rise west of the shelters where Vale often stood with coffee when he needed to think at the speed of weather instead of meetings. He was there now, naturally, holding the same black mug and watching the sunset move copper light across the half-finished second habitation row. I handed him the descents page without introduction. He read it once. Then he handed it back. "They are late," he said. "That seems unfair," I said. "They did rescind the decree." "Yes," he said. "After the walls, the routes, the school, the residents, the contracts, the fabrication line, and the second water system. It is like recognizing a bridge after everyone is already across." I looked down toward Holdfast. Children were still visible in the learning shelter windows, moving in shifting silhouettes around Lucy's tables. George and Vin were bent over the secondary processor again, because success apparently had not cured either of them of their private devotion to repair. Near the North Path, Selly NAR was arguing with a trader over crate ratios while 2 Darren adolescents pretended not to listen and listened to every word. "Does it matter?" I asked. "The rescission?" "Yes." Vale considered that properly. "Yes," he said. "Trade matters. Access matters. Less friction matters. But not in the way the Hall of Measures would prefer." He lifted the mug once toward the basin, a gesture too small to count as emphasis and therefore more convincing than emphasis. "They think they restored us," he said. I followed his gaze. Below us, Holdfast glowed in the first practical lights of evening. Not beautiful in any ornamental sense. Beautiful in the way working places become beautiful when they are too busy surviving honestly to arrange themselves for admiration. "No," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. That night I opened the log for day 37. I expected the entry to feel large. Historic, perhaps. It did not. Or rather, it did, but in the wrong direction. The real history was not the rescission. The real history was that the rescission had arrived into a day already full enough that I had to choose where to place it between a repaired pump, 2 reopened routes, 1 dispute about shelf labeling, and a request from Lucy for more child-height seating before the next vessel came in. I wrote, Day 37. Accord suspended Hall Decree 14 and reopened external trade and registry lanes. Population stable. Incoming traffic increased. Secondary fabrication line approved. More books possible. Status normal. I stopped there. Then, after a moment, I added one more line. They changed the record after the place was already real. I saved the entry and set the slate aside. Outside the record shelter, I could hear the children again. Not words, not clearly, just the layered sound of learning and argument and the sort of noise all species seem to make when something is being built in them at the same time as it is being built around them. I left the slate on the desk and went out to see what they were working on.